Okay, well, I guess I sort of wanted to start my presentation talking a little bit about antibiotic use in the United States and how that has changed recently. Todd introduced the idea that through NAE, we have started to reduce the use of antibiotics within the livestock industry, and our FDA has actually come out and is providing some information now on they're talking about it as usage, but really if you look at it, this is sales and distribution. So these aren't a direct one-to-one relationship between a sale and a utilization in animals, but they do give us some sort of indication of what's going on from a livestock species. We have, I think they've released information going back to 2009, but I've just summarized 16 to 17 here. And what you can see here, well, probably the first thing that jumps out to you is that, at least in the U.S., cattle and swine are using the majority of the antibiotics, followed by turkeys, chickens, and then other. And this is, the FDA is actually breaking this down into medically important and then also non-medically important. So this is the medically important. So what you can see here is, from a poultry standpoint, I think all of our species are generally reducing their antibiotic use, but from a chicken standpoint, you can see a fairly large reduction here, almost a halving of the medically important antibiotics that we're using currently. Now, if we look at the non-medically important, it actually tells a little bit of a different story here, and you can see the non-medically important, and for poultry and cattle, these are almost exclusively 90% plus ionophores. So we are still having some challenges, and we are still using some ionophores out there. What I'm going to predict is that when FDA actually releases this information for 2018, as we've really ramped up that NAE production, at least in the United States, this number here will continue to go down for chickens. But overall, I just wanted to provide a short update on sort of where the U.S. is in terms of antibiotic use, at least according to the FDA. And I wanted to use that as an introduction to this talk so that I can talk about, okay, well, what are some of the consequences that we've run into from that standpoint? So really I'm going to start talking about coccidia infections first, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about Clostridium infections as well. You know, we usually say coccidia, and we talk about that as we have coccidia, but as everyone knows, there are several different species that affect chickens, different species that affect turkeys as well, and they don't infect all at the same place. So I think this is something important that we need to consider as well, is A. cervulina is actually going to be infective in the upper GI tract, the duodenum, and that upper area. And this is where, when we start talking about a coccidial infection, we need to be a little bit specific, because if you have this infection in the duodenum, what you're going to see is you're going to see a larger effect on energy utilization. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But some of our other Emaria species can affect are infective elsewhere. This is actually Tenella in the ceca. And here's where we'd see some different signs. Here you'd actually see some blood in the excreta. But I wanted to talk a little bit about, this is a little bit dated now, but this was the most recent estimate that I could come up with. 90 million to control in the US, and 300 million in losses. I think, especially transitioning to the removal of ionophores, that's going to go up tremendously, but I actually haven't seen any data released for that. So I just wanted to go back and talk a little bit about really what are we looking at for a coccidial infection. Here is a bird that is really not doing well. This is a very serious coccidial infection here. You can see this bird, you can see there's some stunted growth there. You can see the head there is still covered in down. You can see, though, this bird does have substantial feather cover, but those feathers are ruffled up. Certainly not doing well. You can see discolored stool here. And it's a little bit hard to see projected up here, but you can also see a little bit of lightening here in the shank area, especially lightening up here. If we compare that to a similar aged broiler, you can see the vast differences between these two birds. So with that, just some causes of this, certainly this is ubiquitous to chickens and turkeys, or turkeys. We certainly have some seasonal effects here, and a lot of this goes back to this litter moisture, because that's important for the sporulation process. But we tend to see this more in the winter and fall, and that sort of makes sense. As temperatures get colder, we're not moving as much air through our houses, and we're going to end up with a higher moisture content. Looking at that sporulation, and that's really where we're going to see most of our problems. The other thing that we're dealing with is we're recycling oocysts every 6 to 7 days. So you might have a minor challenge to begin with, but that's going to build over time. Hopefully those birds will also build immunity over time, and that's sort of what the cocci vaccine is there to help provide. But what we see is when it gets real bad, it's usually after probably 3, maybe 4 cycles, and then we get a serious outbreak. So I sort of want to transition here and talk about, start talking about necrotic enteritis as well, but there's actually a very good link between the two. And I'm sure at this point I'm not saying anything that's not familiar to you guys, but one of the real causative agents in most of the models that we use for necrotic enteritis, we actually have some sort of cocci challenge. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, when you get the cocci challenge, you get the coccidial spores are going to enter and actually infect cells, and that does a couple of things. One, it's going to decrease that gut integrity. So you're going to get leakage of plasma proteins into this intestinal barrier area. The body's going to respond to that, and it's actually going to increase mucogenesis. So it's going to increase the amount of mucin in that area. So why is that important? When we start thinking about Clostridium perfringens, really it needs a couple things to really bloom. One is excess protein, which is going to come from these plasma proteins leaking into this area. The other is mucus. It actually thrives and does very well with excess mucus. So what we're seeing here then is after we have a coccidial infection, we really open up some sort of challenge, some sort of insult that actually allows the Clostridium perfringens that is there naturally to bloom and become more of a challenge for us. So if we look at this from a growth standpoint, these are just some examples. You can see the lesions are very much different, but you can see still there's a lot of damage here. These are generally in the small intestine area. You can see in very serious cases, there's a lot of disruption, a lot of damage here. There's a little bit newer estimate here, and it's estimated at 1.2 billion in losses. The other thing that I want to point out is, as with some of the coccidial species, when you have a necrotic outbreak, you can definitely see this in the excreta. And I want to come back to that later because I think we've got some issues here. We certainly have some issues here with digestion. If you just look at the damage caused here and what's coming out the back end, that's certainly changed the digestive capability of that bird. So I do want to get into a little bit more about the metabolism and how that host, how that bird is actually viewing this challenge. Because I think it's important to come back and see, we know we have this infection, we know it's going to decrease production, but what is that bird actually doing metabolically to deal with that or to not deal with that? So this is just a table or a figure out of Freitas 2008, where they looked at plasma glucose in both the group A was challenged with a coccidial challenge. So this was just straight cocci. There was no Clostridium put in there at all. And then the solid line here are the control birds. Now what you'll notice first is that the data do jump around, but the way they have it presented here, these are actually pretty tight. So you're going to see about a 250 milligram per deciliter concentration of glucose in the blood. Very, very normal for poultry. And then if you were to average these across, you're probably going to see about a 15 milligram drop with the coccidiosis. And that, I think, can be attributed just to that damage that the coccidia are impairing on the intestinal system. So you can't pull as much much carbohydrate and as much glucose across that barrier system. So you see just a slight depression. It is a slight depression, but it is there. But I want to talk about lipids next, because this is someplace, especially when we have infection with A. cerevisiae, which is up in that upper digestive tract. This is where we can run into some problems with fat digestion. So if you see here, this is total liver lipid as a percentage. And you see again, same thing, the dark is the control, and then this would be the cocci-infected birds. But you can see here, starting a day after and within 2 days, we see a significant drop in liver lipid level. Most of these, the lipids here are going to be coming from two sources, one from the diet and two from lipogenesis there in the liver. So part of this is probably attributed to lack of fat digestion. The other part would be attributed to lower energy status overall. But where it starts to get a little bit more interesting in this story is when we start looking at plasma levels. So here we have plasma fatty acid concentrations and triglycerides over here. And what you can see here, even though the liver has returned itself to a more normal metabolic standpoint within about 2 days, what we see in the blood is we see a continued drop in both fatty acids and also triglycerides, going on 8 days up to almost 2 weeks. So serum fatty acid triglyceride levels require a lot longer to recover here. And this gets into some of the ideas that we have around that energy metabolism that Todd was talking about earlier, and those huge drops in energy digestibility that we see with coccidial infection. So we've got some digestibility data here, and this was done back in Dr. Parsons' lab. But we did both some amino acid digestibility, and then we also did AMEN. And what I want to point out here is you'll see there's a little bit of variation here. Threonine was about 30%, 25%. The rest of them were pretty close to between 12 and 18. Going back to what Todd was saying earlier, it's not surprising to me that threonine digestibility is going to go down. That probably has less to do with actual digestibility and more to do with increased mucin being secreted during this challenge. And these numbers are actually generated about 4 days after infection. So going really 4 to 5 days, so going really into that peak first infection. And we actually have data going out after that where we see after this first period of infection, the bird actually recovers from a digestibility standpoint fairly well. But the thing that I want to point out is here, if we disregard the threonine, we see between 12 and 13, say, for an average, say, 16% reduction in amino acid digestibility here. But again, from an energy standpoint, we see a 30% reduction. This is going to go back to that disruption in the duodenum and really a disruption of fat metabolism that we can see carried out through that entire bird, starting in the liver and going into the plasma as well. So one of the things that we've done a little bit more recently is we started looking at body composition in comparison to some of our different disease statuses in birds. And body composition just takes that next step from digestibility and says, really, how is that bird then able to utilize and or store the nutrients that it's taking in? And this was an experiment we did at Virginia Tech. It was done in collaboration with Dr. DeLuel's lab. And what we saw is after we challenged these birds, we saw about a 7% reduction in lean tissue. We have a DEXA there at Virginia Tech, and after the birds have been euthanized, we'll defeather them and take them through that DEXA process. But the really interesting thing that goes hand in hand with our digestibility is that when we looked at the fat stores in these birds, we saw fatty tissue actually had a 17% reduction there. So this goes further along with our story that from a coccidial standpoint, we're really affecting energy metabolism, fat metabolism specifically, and we are really altering not just the body weight of these birds, but we're altering the composition of these birds. It really comes back to an energy deficiency in this standpoint, and this is really what's limiting that growth when we get into a coccidial infection. So just to summarize sort of my thoughts on the coccidial infection, it's caused by protozoal Amaria species, and it's made with multiple points within the intestinal tract. So again, there's some specificity here. It can cause that damage needed to facilitate necrotic enteritis. It's not the only thing associated with necrotic enteritis, but it is one of the predisposing factors. And it reduces performance overall. Invasion of the intestine causes that immune response, that 10% number that Dr. Claising has come out with, I think is still very appropriate for here. It decreases both amino acid and energy digestibility, and we certainly see that it changes fatty acid metabolism. And I think that's where when we see these differences in fat response or in energy response, they're coming through that lipid metabolism area. So just to continue from a body composition standpoint, reduced fat digestion reflected in the larger proportional reduction in body fat compared to that lean tissue. So I want to talk a little bit now about necrotic enteritis or the disease associated with unchecked Clostridium perfringens. And here, actually, I specifically will say this about the digestibility values, but here in general, I think we have a little bit less knowledge about how the bird itself responds to this. I actually, when I combed through the literature, I couldn't find anything from how necrotic enteritis actually affects either amino acid or energy metabolism. I was actually sort of surprised by that. But with some of the issues we have with replicating that in the lab, I really wasn't all that surprised at the end of the day. But some of the information that I was able to find is looking at cellular damage. So aspartate aminotransferase and alanine aminotransferase are basically just indicators. If you see them in the plasma, they're indicators of cellular damage. So what we're looking at here are birds that were infected with a necrotic enteritis model, and you can see there were significant increases in both of these enzymes in the plasma. So as you would expect, by looking at those first pictures, you're getting cellular damage here. You're getting release of those contents into the plasma. I was able to find some some enzyme data that goes hand in hand with the Clostridium perfringens model. And what we see for amylase, so general carbohydrate, we see, so this white bar is the non-challenged control, and then we have the necrotic enteritis model here. So we see a significant reduction when we have necrotic enteritis. So this is, again, that cellular damage within the intestine actually reducing that enzyme activity that we see. Same thing for trypsin. So this would be an indicator there for protein. We see a significant reduction here, again, indicating a general response reduction in enzyme. The interesting thing here is for lipase. Now this is in the jejunum or the ileum, and I realize that a lot of the lipase is coming from the pancreas or the duodenum up higher in the digestive tract, but we actually don't see any significant differences here. So this is sort of the first indication where we might have some differences between the host response to the coccidiosis, where we saw a definite change in fat metabolism, and now this secondary bacterial infection, where we see a more consistent effect in both carbohydrate and protein, maybe less so here in the lipid enzymes. We have some plasma glucose concentrations here, actually just the opposite of what happened in the coccidial infection. Here we saw an increase, but then when we look at triglycerides in the blood, we see no change across two different experiments. So again, some differences when we're looking at blood concentrations of some of our metabolites during these infection models. We've got a couple different things here. We've got some hepatic fatty acid synthesis going on here. These data are sort of contrary. In the first model, you see an increase in both ACC and FAS. This is mRNA expression. But in the second data, there's really no difference here between the non-infected controls and the necrotic enteritis model. So maybe some differences, maybe some upregulation from an mRNA level, but no real strong consistent responses here from a metabolic standpoint. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on these first three bars. I'll just make the statement here that Clostridium can alter fat metabolism. But what I do want to focus on here is this last column, this abdominal fat. So this is just an abdominal fat pad weight expressed as a percentage of the body weight. And what you can see here, it's a very small increase, but in this experiment it was significant. You can see a significant increase in abdominal fat pad weight with this necrotic enteritis model. So very different from what we've seen with the coccidial model, where we're really pushing that energy loss, and we actually saw a loss in fat composition. We've actually, I did want to come back to the digestibility and just reiterate this. If you look at all the cellular damage that occurs in the intestines and this, there's got to be nutrient digestibility losses here, but unfortunately, this is something that I could not find. I think there's been some work on it, I just couldn't find it in the literature, so hopefully we get some reported values on this here soon. But again, I think this goes back to some of the challenges we have working with this model, and that we need to continue to work on this model, develop this, and generate some of the background data that we have with Cocci so that we can understand more what this Clostridium is doing from a host standpoint. So we do have some body composition responses with a Clostridium challenge, and as you would expect here, so here was the total mass of the birds that we looked at from a DEXA standpoint. And then when we look at it from a fat mass standpoint and a lean mass standpoint, we can see very, very similar reductions. So contrary to what we saw before with coccidiosis, it looks like this is a more one-to-one reduction, lean mass to fatty mass here, and there's not that real challenge to fat digestion here. So just to summarize what we have from a necrotic enteritis standpoint, caused by secondary, you really need a primary insult, bacterial species that invades the intestinal tract, reduces performance overall. If it's a bad outbreak, it's certainly going to be accompanied with increased mortality. Invasion of the intestines causes that immune response, as has been talked about earlier. Little information out there on amino acid and energy digestibility, but doesn't seem to have as large effect on fat metabolism, or it might even increase it a little bit. But I think those values are still sort of questionable in my mind. I think we need a little bit more information from that standpoint. But from a body composition standpoint, we certainly see that reduced performance, and that's partitioned apart, across both that lean and fatty tissue pretty equally. And then in conclusion, in the absence of antibiotics, both the coccidiosis and necrotic enteritis will continue to be major economic drivers, and the antibiotics here I'm talking about are mostly the ionophores. Certainly necrotic enteritis can be controlled with antibiotics as well, but again, as that cocci is really a precursor to necrotic, you know, the removal of ionophores, I think, is going to be very difficult to overcome. Although both can attack poultry in similar areas, and they can facilitate cross-infection, the metabolic responses of these birds really do seem to differ. And the cocci appears to alter that fat metabolism more, and you see increased issues with fat absorption, and even longer-term issues with fat metabolism in general. And then the necrotic actually appears to be relatively consistent across both that lean tissue and that fatty tissue. So, and the body composition data do seem to validate these conclusions. So, certainly thank you guys for your attention, and if I'd be able to answer any questions.